the record year being 2022, when around 46,000 people reached the UK in that way. That's without authorization. But the whole idea of Brexit was to get immigration down. Immigration after Brexit was 3 times what it was in the pre-Brexit period, so that's been a source of controversy. The UK still retains a reputation for being particularly welcoming, tolerant of refugees and immigrants.
Given the UK's history of multiculturalism, why is there a growing anti-immigrant rhetoric? Hello and a very warm welcome. You're watching Hindustan Times and my name is Aayesha Varma. The UK is pushing through its biggest shakeup of the asylum system in decades, turning refugee status into a more temporary, conditional form of protection. Ministers say the system is out of control and too many people are exploiting dangerous routes across the channel, while critics warn these changes will erode refugee rights and inflame tensions in an already polarized debate over immigration. Joining us at this point is Dr. Peter Walsh, a senior researcher at the Migration Observatory. Mr. Walsh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
First things first. A few weeks ago, the United Kingdom announced a major overhaul of the refugee system. Refugee status would be made temporary and the deportation of those who arrived illegally would be sped up. Could you elaborate on why this change is being made and what abuses of the system are currently underway?
Yeah, so it's all to do with increasing numbers of people arriving in the UK without authorization by crossing the English Channel from France in small boats. Now, this emerged as a phenomenon at the end of 2018, when our Interior Minister announced that this was a national incident, so a very important kind of emergency. That was only when 300 people arrived. The numbers have really increased substantially since then, the record year being 2022, when around 46,000 people reached the UK in that way. That's without authorization. Now, I should say, almost all individuals arriving in this way, they do claim asylum. About 99% claim asylum. And actually, a majority, about 2/3, are successful in that asylum claim. But this form of immigration has proved deeply unpopular with the British public. We know why, even though it makes up only a small share of immigration, because successive governments have emphasized the importance of controlling the border. And of course, these small boat arrivals are very clear evidence of a lack of control.
Speaking about the statements that have been made, there is a Labour lawmaker, Tony Vaughan, who was one of the first to publicly criticize the proposal and said that the rhetoric would only encourage the culture of divisiveness that allows racism to grow. Do you agree?
I don't have a view on political questions. I focus on the analysis, I focus on the data, and I focus on the evidence. It is true that that is a big concern. And we've seen in recent years in the UK riots that have focused on immigration. It's focused on unauthorized arrivals by small boat. It's focused on asylum seekers being housed in hotels. That's a very contentious issue. And it's one that successive governments have tried to show that they have a grasp on. And that's really what's behind these proposals. The main aim is deterrence, to try to deter individuals from coming to the UK without authorization to claim asylum.
I'm curious, given the UK's history of multiculturalism, why is there a growing anti-immigrant rhetoric?
It's an interesting question. And, it's not entirely clear, but at least a part of it seems to have been driven by this very unpopular form of immigration, which is this unauthorized migration. There's really there's a lack of support for this particular kind of immigration that seems to be driving so much of the anti-immigration sentiment in the UK. Of course, this goes back to the pre-Brexit period when the UK was experiencing record inflows of immigration, especially from Eastern Europe. And then Brexit happened. And actually that led to a thawing of attitudes on immigration. People became more open to immigration. Attitudes were softer. But that has, in large part, been reversed by record immigration after Brexit. Remember, the whole idea of Brexit was to get immigration down. Immigration after Brexit was 3 times what it was in the pre-Brexit period. So that's been a source of controversy. The other source, of course, small boat arrivals, the endless daily spectacle of people arriving without authorization and reaching the UK in that unauthorized manner.
Absolutely. And you have been talking about the data points here and how much it's only increased over the years. Asylum claims in Britain are reportedly at a record high. Around 11,000 applications were made in the year till June 2025, I believe. So why do you think so many people choose Britain as an immigration destination?
Yeah, so that's 111,000. That beats the previous record that was set in
Okay.
2002. And what's really interesting is that while we've seen these record increases in asylum claims in the UK, in the EU, numbers are actually down. They've fallen in the EU. So more people are coming to the UK. And that's what we have to try to explain. Now, it's a complex picture. There are some factors that inevitably draw people to the UK, the English language, colonial ties. Also, it's been shown that the presence of family members, members of the community, friends, they're a big pull. And of course, as that population gets bigger in the UK, that tends to generate even more immigration in the future. But there's also two other things. The UK still retains a reputation for being particularly welcoming, tolerant of refugees and immigrants. And then there's this other factor, which there's emerging evidence for, what we might call the Brexit effect, which is that, okay, the UK is no longer a part of the European Union. And because of that, we no longer have access to the EU's fingerprint database for asylum seekers. And that means that an individual can claim asylum in the EU, be refused. And actually, if they come to the UK, we won't know that they've been refused in an EU country. If we did, we'd be able to issue a speedier refusal of the claim. That's no longer possible. And so individuals understand if they can make it to the UK, in all chances, we will process their claim and they perhaps have a decent chance of getting status in Europe after all.
All right. So speaking of being welcoming, massive anti-immigration protests have been witnessed around the world this year. How important is the immigration issue or rather the refugee issue for voters in the UK? And how do the Labour and Conservative Party balance the matter?
It's a huge issue. So there is a poll in the UK that's conducted every month and has been for decades. And it asks, what is the biggest issue facing the UK today? In the pre-Brexit period, unusually, immigration topped that chart, knocking the economy and the National Health Service into second and third place. Now, that reversed in the post-Brexit referendum period, and now immigration is atop of the list. And when you break it down, immigration, there's all sorts of types of immigration. Well, actually, when you break it down, it's clear there are particular forms of immigration that are particularly unpopular. And that's your small boat arrivals and by association, asylum seeking, because almost all individuals arriving by small boat, they do claim asylum. It's a huge issue.
So the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, a former human rights lawyer as well, also believes that Britain's current asylum regime isn't exactly designed to deal with the large number of asylum seekers, which are moving across the globe. Do you think that the anti-immigration trend will only continue to spread?
That's certainly been the trend over the past few years. And we see it not only in major immigrant receiving countries like the UK, we see it with particular relevance in the United States under Donald Trump, but also we've seen a rise in the popularity of far-right parties across Europe. And what do they have in common? Well, they often have at their heart a more restrictive immigration policy. So this appears to be the trend. And alongside that, we see a trend towards increasing restriction of migration policy and in particular of asylum policy. Of course, these asylum proposals in the UK, they actually take inspiration from Denmark. And that's no coincidence because Denmark is understood to have one of the toughest asylum policies in Europe.
So, something that you had drawn upon earlier is one of the things that probably draws people into the UK when it comes to refugee status and wanting to immigrate. Nigel Farage's party, the Reform UK, wants to stop most overseas students from bringing family members. Don't you think that this is going to have a negative impact on culture and diversity in the UK and finances for UK institutions as well? Because students would be less inclined to apply for courses.
Well, it certainly already had an impact. So the previous Conservative government, they introduced actually a really important restriction on students, which was preventing master's students, undergraduate students already didn't have this right, but preventing master's students from coming to the UK with their partner and children if they have any. And we've already seen this have a big impact with many fewer students coming to study in UK universities. And this is something that universities are very anxious about because they charge considerably higher tuition fees for international students. And there are many universities that rely critically on those higher fees and on the money from international students to finance them. And of course, there are knock-on effects in local economies with local businesses and so on. So this has actually become a really big issue, the question of student migration, especially because, well, most students go home after they study. They don't stay permanently, and they do make big net fiscal contributions to the economy.
So now moving beyond the UK, the US President Donald Trump's administration said that it paused all immigration applications, including green card and US citizenship processing, filed by immigrants from about 19 non-European countries, citing concerns over national security and public safety. Seems to be along a similar trend. So how do you view this move?
Yeah, well, this is even more restrictive than what's being proposed in Europe. And of course, Trump's critics have suggested that, well, there's a strong symbolic component to policies like this with their broad exclusionary character. Yes, there are always security risks associated with any form of immigration. But of course, the human rights charities and groups are up in arms about restrictions like that. We haven't seen restrictions quite that far in most European countries, but still the trend is very much towards restriction, and especially of the asylum system. And that's what we're seeing with these UK proposals, essentially proposing to remove permanent residence for refugees.
All right, Mr. Walsh, thank you so much for joining us and speaking to us about this topic.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.